Well, good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending on where you are in this world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar, Winning at Culture, the Keys to the Successful DevOps Organization. We have a great webinar on tap today and lots of great information, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we'd like to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded. So if you miss any or all of the event, you will be receiving a link after the event in an email that you can access the webinar on demand. And also links to the slides and, as I said, the recording will be available as well. Also, we are taking questions from the audience. So at any time during the event, you have a question for our panelists, just use your GoToWebinar control panel, submit your question, and we'll take a few minutes before the end of the event and we'll go over those audience questions. Okay, with that, let's go ahead and dive right on into today's webinar. Our speaker today is TJ Randall, who is VP of Customer Success at Xebia Labs. Hi, TJ, how are you?
Good, Charlene. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Before I turn it over to you, I do want to just alert the audience that today's presentation is kind of fun because there's an Easter egg in the presentation. And if you pay attention and you figure out what that Easter egg is, then you may be rewarded with a box of swag from Xebia Labs. So pay attention. And if you do find it, just send us a little message either in the questions tab or in the chat. And hopefully somebody will find it. So with that, TJ, go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and let you do your thing, put myself on mute.
Okay, I feel like we should cue the music. Here comes the Easter egg. So.
Right, there we go.
Well, hello, everyone. And today, the webinar today, the goal is we're going to start to talk about something that's probably the most challenging aspect of DevOps, right? We understand it's people, process, tools. Well, today we're going to talk about culture, which really includes the people and process part. So we want to basically discuss how people work together, as well as how they view their role, right? In your organization today, as you start your DevOps transformation, or even as you're working through that, that's what people are trying to figure out, right? They're trying to figure out, how do I fit into this new model? And it's that relationship between, working together as well as how they see their own role in this process. It basically affects how successful you're going to be with this, delivery pipeline change that you're making within your organization. So as we said, right, DevOps itself, there's three components that you always have to focus on. I feel like this is talked about an awful lot, but I don't know how often it's addressed. So what we like to call out the fact that because it's people, process, tools, we actually like to focus on them in that order. So one of the benefits of my role at Xebia Labs is I run the customer success organization, and I jokingly say I get to do DevOps for real. So I get to do DevOps in implementations and trainings, helping customers transform their organization. And so I can tell you, with these large enterprise customers that we work with, this is the conversation that we're having with them. Not just about the tooling and setting up the tools in the proper way and getting all those things organized. That's important, and we will be talking about that. I like to make sure that people remember the other 2/3 part of the process, this overall solution. It's the people in the process. So what does that mean? So what is the key for unlocking the DevOps culture? So actually, there's really 6 of them that we're going to focus on today. So let's dive in. Key 1. So winning at DevOps, this sounds like a no-brainer, but a lot of times we find that it's not necessarily the focus for the transformation, but DevOps requires the entire organization. And what does that really mean? Well, it means that everyone who's responsible for delivering solutions within your organization needs to be involved in the process. So you'll hear a lot of folks talk about that. A great example, you need to get executive leadership and sponsorship. And it's important, right? It's not because they're going to necessarily guide you and pick the solutions and tell you what to do, but what you really need to leverage from them is that clear vision. And you need to understand expectations, because unfortunately, especially in large organizations, these types of transformations take a lot of time. It takes a lot of resources and a lot of energy. So getting that clear vision and getting an understanding of what is being expected of folks as part of it is super important. And I'll give you an example of what that can look like. We've had customers that developed the concept of a center of excellence around DevOps. And what they leverage that for, again, it's not like a dictating board to tell people what they have to do and which tools they need to use. What we find, the more successful implementation of a center of excellence is helping new application teams on board. So the center of excellence understands how does this DevOps transformation fit across the entire organization. And so therefore, they tend to be really good consultants for new teams that want to hop on board and want to transform their applications locally. So what that really means is you want to, if this is something that you want to do within your organization, you want to be able to create a process for them. And that process really is, how do I enter into that center of excellence? Meaning, how do I engage with them? Because what they're going to talk to you about is not necessarily about like, hey, you got to move to this branching strategy, or you need to move to this particular, programming language to upgrade your application. They're going to talk to you about different things, like what are the necessary skills in order to actually, successfully transform your application. That's important because that kind of advice, that consultative approach, tends to be really important because now you're starting to get consistency. Now teams, even though they may be developing on different platforms or different solutions, there's a consistency across that basically people start to understand. And it helps them fit into the, this new model, this new organizational model where the company is going. Cool. So key number 2, this is really about the application delivery pipeline. So a lot of times when we talk to folks initially, they say, hey, we're doing this thing, this DevOps thing, and they tend to hyper-focus either on the dev side or the operation side, right? It's bringing dev and ops together. And what I see out of that is a lot of times it's the middle of the pipe that kind of gets forgotten. So, companies get really good at, getting synergy between the development teams, delivering solutions faster to operations. But you got to really think about the entire delivery pipeline. Let's say you have a traditional model where you have a dev, a QA, a stage, and a prod. You want to make sure you don't leave anybody behind in those processes as well as those people as you're changing the organization. And what does that mean? Well, it means you're not just modernizing the application code. That's super important, right? You want to be able to do some things differently so that you are able to deliver code changes faster. It also means you're going to modernize the skill sets for those folks as well. So not just your developers learning a new language. Imagine your QA staff who can now deploy their applications automatically based on the project schedules. Well, that's a new skill set for them. In the past, they might have been reliant on the development teams to do that for them. So again, you have to think about the skills that people need in order to modernize your pipeline. And what we find 9 times out of 10 is you don't need different people, right? This isn't automation does not mean that we're going to downsize. What we really find is we need to leverage the people and the resources that we have. We just need to help them, gather those new skills in which to, work within this new model. So what does that mean for you as an organization? Well, I think an important focus, we got to think about these skills and knowledge and make that a focus of your transformation. Okay, so that means giving them time, giving them direction to grow, and basically give them a path in which to change. So a typical example we see is you'll be doing a set of applications, you're modernizing them, maybe you're moving those to containers, right? So you're taking a legacy application, you're breaking it apart, and it's moving to containers. Well, that's a lot of technology change for people, but it's also a lot of process change for how those applications will be moved along your delivery cycle. And an example that we have that we were just working with a customer last week is they were actually removing environments in that delivery pipeline. So one of the questions that came out, somebody said, well, what happens when we don't have to move it to stage and training at the same time because it was a containerized app? It was just a matter of they were kind of thinking about, does that mean I don't have a job anymore? Of course, the answer that came back is you're even more fundamental to the process. We need you to be part of the development team so that you're in early on in the cycle of the development of the solution. So we don't need to do that late testing QA before production. So again, it's really thinking about the people and the process, making sure they have the skills to actually operate and do their job within this new delivery pipeline. And then what you'll find, you'll actually start to speed up in your overall DevOps transformation because once the people and the processes are in place, now it's a little bit of an easier task to then move those new applications and move your software changes as your infrastructure is evolving. So, key number 3. This is actually an interesting one. Communication it's a word that gets overused an awful lot, but we like to call this out in terms of you want to make sure you're communicating what DevOps changes mean for everybody. So what does that really mean? Well, DevOps, there's kind of the saying out there, you can't buy a DevOps, you can't build the DevOps, you can't, go to Home Depot and pull one off the shelf. DevOps really is about that cultural change of the organization. It's about embracing that you're going to deliver better software faster. And you're going to do it in a way that basically everybody gains efficiencies along that, delivery pipeline. So what's so key here is we need to make sure there's an open channel of communication about all the changes that are occurring. So think of like agile methodology, right? One of the most critical features of that is this feedback loop of like trying something, implementing the solution, and then taking that feedback and putting that back into the process. Whether that's good or whether that's bad, but that feedback loop has to happen in order for you to get better and more agile. So really, this is an example kind of back to, key number one, leadership needs to convey to people how their roles will be affected and where the teams are fit going forward. But that's not just a one-time, hey, we're going to do this DevOps thing. It's more of, think about it for the long haul. There's no finish line. There's no line in the sand that once we get there, we're doing a DevOps. So from leadership all the way down, you need to have things like regular meetings and to create that glue. And what do those meetings look like? Well, I've seen a couple different forms. I've seen companies leverage, town hall events. We were at a particular bank up in Canada. They have like a DevOps meetup that they televise for their entire organization. So if you can't join it in person, you're able to join and interact with them. We have other people where the organization is so large, they leverage mediums like Confluence, like wikis and, videos and things like that they disseminate across the organization. But I can tell you the most successful DevOps transformations that I've seen are the ones that include communication as part of their key deliverables. It doesn't happen in isolation. It may start out with a few teams, but if you're going to do it right across your organization, you need to make sure it's a company-wide affair.
Hey, TJ, can I break in for just a second?
Of course you can, sure.
Yeah. So when you're talking about it, making it a company-wide affair, how deep does that need to go? Because obviously, certain departments such as marketing, finance, things like that, they're not going to be doing DevOps in the traditional sense, the development and operations, and so how much do they need to know, and how involved do they need to be?
I think, that's a great question. It's funny you say that. I from the surface, I would actually disagree with you. Depending on the type of company that you are, normally what I see as a DevOps transformation grows within an organization, even those air quote non-traditional teams do get involved. Because, for example, marketing might be a consumer of an application, an internal application that is moving to this new model. So all of a sudden, for example, your marketing team needs to get trained at a faster pace because guess what? Your developers are actually delivering changes faster. Think about your financial teams. They're the ones that kind of work in a silo into their own, right? They're working in a different area of the company, but their applications are being supported by IT just like everyone else. So again, it gets back to communication. It's not just telling people that more change is coming faster. It's also helping them consume that change, right? If, imagine if your development team have a financial, application, an in-house financial application, and they start delivering enhancements every 2 weeks, which is a change from every quarter, or twice a year. Now those finance folks, all of a sudden, if you don't communicate that, if they don't get to be part of the process, they're going to be kind of drinking from the fire hose. They're going to be like, wait a minute, why does the system keep changing every 2 weeks? So it's a critical way of which to bring them in and say, okay, this is this new process that we're following. It's not about the coding and the tooling and those things. You're actually a consumer of those changes. Okay. Is that what you were kind of thinking about?
Yeah. And along with that, though, I was wondering if kind of the messaging that goes out to these, the folks outside of IT, if that messaging regarding the DevOps transformation, if that has to change or be different from what's being communicated within IT. Is it is it a more difficult buy-in for those folks outside of IT? Do you have to kind of sell the benefits of DevOps more or harder to those guys?
I think, yeah, that's especially with people being resistant to change, right? I think the communication has to be, targeted toward the appropriate group. I think so you're spot on. Talking about new CI techniques and new code branching techniques and security scans might not be the highest level of interest for your finance team. We'll stick to that example, right? What they actually just see is more changes are coming faster. So they might be on board, and you're right about selling. You really do have to sell them that. You're like, hey, guess what, guys? You were really frustrated with our ERP system because it didn't have XYZ features. We were able to deliver those in less than a month when it used to take us half a year. So I guess that really is selling, right? You're letting them know what's the benefit of now consuming these changes faster. So yeah, it's definitely important to think about the audience and think about what that communication looks like.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'll let you get back to it.
No, we'll keep it coming. All right.
Okay.
Cool. So key number 4. So the people and process must be supported by metrics. How come this is another word that communication gets thrown out a lot, but I don't know if people really stop and think about what this means. Really the advice here, and then our goal, especially from an XDB Labs perspective, is we want to identify the right metrics. You'll hear a lot of discussion, for example, around, people saying, okay, let me measure code commit to delivery within production. That's an important metric, right? How long does it take my development staff to deliver a change into a production environment? And it's actually a really nice metric to use when you're talking about things like moving to Agile, moving to DevOps, because people can really put their heads around that. They're like, wow, it used to take a developer a whole, 3 whole months, a whole quarter to get a change to the website done. Now they can do that in 3 weeks. So that's not a bad metric to use. What I'm kind of calling out here is I think it's important to think about your organization. You want those metrics, kind of like what you asked about earlier, Charlene. You want metrics that are meaningful for the people that have to consume these changes, because what they really want to do, they want to be able to see into the process to determine like if they're doing the right things. I'll give you an example of that. So just because you're speeding up your application, we had a customer about a month ago, one of their delivery patterns was they had a training environment. It was their applications that they were building were all customer facing, external customer facing. So the applications that they were delivering to their production environment were speeding up. So they were getting to a cadence where they were actually delivering every 3 to 4 weeks changes. One of the groups they hadn't really talked to was the training department. They were the ones responsible for, updating the website for customers. They were responsible for having ad hoc, webinars just like this to teach customers about new features, etc. So what they found is because, they weren't communicating well, they introduced a problem. The other thing that they weren't able to do is understand how their application, their project deadlines that they were moving to actually fit into the overall organization's project and timelines as well. So really the metrics they wanted to be able to, measure is how well could our training department actually accept changes and how does that affect the overall delivery? So what ended up happening in this particular example is the dev team actually kept at their cadence of 3 to 4 weeks, but the training team had negotiated with the project team to say, look, we're only going to do training after every 2 releases, which doesn't sound like that big of a solution, but for them, it was actually significant because they had so much training work in which to actually accomplish. So by understanding the metrics within the organization and like looking at the metrics that was relevant for the, the different teams in the delivery pipeline, they were actually able to negotiate what they needed as part of that transformation. So it's kind of a way to think about your metrics in a little bit different way. You don't just need to do kind of the standard, are we moving faster? You really want to, that, by the way, that's important. You also want to think of a lot of the other pieces, like why are we moving faster? Is code quality going up? Are we decreasing the number of defects per release? We have another customer, they actually, one of the things that they talked about is they had a team that moved onto their new DevOps platform, and they actually noticed that they were starting to introduce more defects into production unintentionally, of course, but it was because they had missed some of the early testing that they were doing before. So again, I think with DevOps transformations, especially in large organizations, it's super important to think about the metrics that the teams will use, and then actively use them as part of your conversation. All right. So key number 5. This is one of my favorites, the DevOps legacy, no apps left behind. So we have a customer, they actually don't call them legacy applications, they call them mature applications, which I tend to like very much. I always say I'm not a legacy IT guy. But the important piece here, the thing to think about is it's really easy when you're thinking about a DevOps transformation to basically focus on the easier apps. And I say easier in air quotes. It's, the greenfield application. It's the new microservices. It's the new cloud applications. Those tend to be easy for a couple of different reasons within an organization. And it's not because they don't meet the security requirements, etc. But the problem tends to be is every organization really has 3 types of applications. They have these legacy or mature applications. Then they have this set of applications, which is usually the largest set, which is the applications that they're going to invest in to move to the new platform. And then, of course, your greenfield applications. So what we mean here in this slide is we want to determine which applications, will be moving towards the new platform. And obviously that takes time and resources to basically move them over. And we also want to think about what are those legacy / mature / traditional applications that aren't moving to the new platform. It's important to recognize those for 2 reasons. One, it doesn't mean just because, they're not cloud native apps, they can't move into a DevOps, delivery model. What it really means is we want to think about how do we maintain these applications and how do we standardize their release? Because the goal here is consistency and repeatability. Regardless of whether you're a mainframe application or a new, web microservice that's being delivered. We want our, DevOps process to provide us that consistency and repeatability so that, now all of a sudden, we're delivering code faster. So one example that we call an awful lot, the mainframe, I think a lot of us IT folks can remember, back when the mainframe was going to, quote, go away. Well, they're not going anywhere, and they're not going anywhere soon. They're important, critical to the organization. So it's important to think about how do we deliver, not just that particular piece of software, deliver mainframe code. How do we deliver the services that are associated with that? That's a great example of the, quote, legacy stuff that tends to get forgotten as part of a DevOps transformation. So again, investing in your staff, you're starting to hear the themes start to repeat themselves, right? It's investment in the staff so they can basically take advantage of this new DevOps platform that you're implementing. And how can they modernize their own delivery process? A perfect example is we have a customer, a lot of services around their mainframe applications, and those services have, a lot of dependencies within them. So one of their key areas of focus was they actually didn't necessarily need to speed up their delivery. They deliver about once a quarter. What they wanted to do is basically modernize their delivery process so that they didn't have to basically keep an Excel spreadsheet to maintain the dependencies between the applications. So it's actually kind of a neat solution that they've implemented in the sense of they've been able to automate the dependency management aspect of the application delivery process. So it's not speeding up for them. It's really about the consistency and the visibility to see that. So when you're thinking about these legacy apps, these mature applications, I think it's really important. You want to think about not only the tooling, you want to think obviously about the people and process, and I also like to call out the APIs because this is another entry point in which customers will leverage like modernizing, the old legacy stuff, but also giving the ability for other systems to integrate with it. That integration does bring dependency management into the picture. So think about that. If you're going to include all your applications, which we recommend, you also think about how these things are dependent and how can we get that consistency and repeatability. Okay, key number 6, celebrate success in production. So this is one we call out an awful lot. It's awful easy to do a lot of this kind of transformation in the, quote, lower environments, right? In development, super easy to automate. And as we all know, if you're part of a large organization, it's really hard to do these things in your production environments. Whether they're internal applications, whether external facing applications, it's challenging to implement, DevOps changes and DevOps delivery patterns all the way through production. So one of the things we recommend highly is that's the place where you want to, really celebrate the contributions of your team. When you've been able to transform a set of applications and you've been able to work with all the people involved in that delivery pipeline, they've done a lot of work. And that not only comes in terms of, hours, making sure that they have the right widgets and all the right reports and all those things. They've also invested themselves into the process, right? They've made the commitment to say, hey, I want to be part of this new modern delivery pattern. So it's a great time to basically, to just basically celebrate and show that, yes, you reached an important milestone. You were able to do something where, the challenge was put out there and the teams, all pitched in and were able to succeed. And at that point, it's, yes, you set your milestone. We also want to talk about the lessons learned. Again, think about the agile feedback loop, right? That team that just modernized their delivery process through the production just learned an awful lot. They learned a lot about how to modernize an application and maybe an application stack. They've also learned about the organization and maybe the changes that the organization had to make to be able to do this in this new form. And so it's important for them to be able to share those lessons learned as well and talk about the challenges that they had to overcome. A classic example here I tend to think about is, most large organizations, especially the more regulated organizations, have all types of auditing requirements that they need to provide as they deliver application solutions from development through production. Well, part of the DevOps transformation is understanding that, like what has to be delivered, and seeing what can be done to basically automate some of that away as well. Imagine if you could automate, the building of audit reports that the auditors would then use to sign off on the delivery of applications. Well, once you've solved it, that's an important thing to share across the teams, because those are the things that aren't application or operating system dependent, right? Those are things that the entire organization can benefit those learnings. So it's really about, it's helping folks understand the context of the win. You know what I mean? It really means like, hey, I work in QA and this is how I used to do my job. I worked with the development teams and, I still fulfill all the requirements so that I can do my job, but I was able to actually learn some new skills. I was able to learn some new patterns in which to do that. So it's a lot of fun too. I've seen a lot of customers do this, and when we say throw a huge celebration, you can imagine this can take many different forms. We actually have a customer who had 4 application teams in the initial DevOps transformation. So they were building out that platform, they were moving to cloud, and the teams were disparate. They were located across several locations. When they made it to production and they had a huge, town hall celebration, they actually gave all the team members Amazon gift cards. It was like a nice way to say, hey, thanks for all your hard work. People who really appreciated that. And it was a lot of fun for them. And guess what? It made the rest of the organization see like, hey, I can actually, latch on to this success. We can actually do what they were able to achieve. So celebrating in production, I think, is one of the huge things that an organization can do to get that win and get other teams excited about, moving towards DevOps. Key 7, technology can help improve the culture. Well, we've been talking about people, process, tools. We don't, obviously tooling is a part of this. And if you notice in the DevOps space, focus does tend to be, a lot of times a lot of focus is spent initially on the tooling side. So as we've been talking about today, we feel it's important to address people, process, and the tooling. One of the things I think that's important that people tend to miss is that tools can actually help support the culture as well. Maybe that's a little bit strange to think about, but I'll give an example that happens an awful lot. If your developers are modernizing their applications and they're moving to a more modern continuous integration build system, for developers, they love looking at log files. When they're troubleshooting, something goes wrong, they start scrolling through the logs and they find the issue and then they're off to the races. But what you'll notice in most organizations is that people like, release managers and, BAs and PMs, they don't want to go to log files to try to figure out, what happened when the delivery didn't work in QA. So when we think about the tools that we're going to bring in as part of your DevOps transformation, really we're back to the same, core tenet, which is you need to think about all the people that are involved with the delivery of your application from development through production. And in that way, you can start to ask those questions like, hey, when I move an application to the staging environment, the pre-production environment, talk to the operations people. What do you need to be able to see as part of that delivery event? Operations doesn't want to look through log files either. What they want to know is what change sets are coming, what are the dependencies of those changes, and what's the risk? So you need to be able to provide that information, and your tools should be able to provide that for you. It's not something that you should have to build as an afterthought. As you're doing these evaluations, you really want to think about that. You're like, how do I inform all the folks along that delivery path? And so we always focus on the delivery pipeline, but I will call it out again. You need to think about all the environments along that pipeline, not just your dev and your production sides of the pipe. And then when you take that complete view, I think that's the key of basically when you're speaking with other teams and other groups, you need to think about, like we've been talking about today, all those different application teams out there, they have to have a say into what that platform would look like. Now, what does that mean in reality? It means that, it's pretty typical for most large organizations. Application teams are going to use whatever CI tool that they need to use locally, to build their applications. So there's no need for a company to say, hey, guess what? You all have to move to this CI tool and you can't use the other one. That's kind of silly. But if you think about it from the post-build area, when we start thinking about, the QA, the stage, and the prod environments, it really changes the way the developers think about the toolkits as well. They say, okay, once I'm done building my application, once I have my pull request and I'm ready to push forward, what should that platform look like so I can provide the information that I need? Because the secret to the sauce here is, whether you're building Windows applications, whether you're building, legacy WAR files that are going to, WebSphere, the information that you need to provide to the teams as the application moves forward is the same. What changed, where, who made the changes, how do I deliver the application, all of those questions. So creating a pipeline, that can help all the different teams on board as well as answer those questions is key. And that's, it's a key for success. So let's review. For unlocking your DevOps culture, we want to involve the entire organization. We want to empower your teams by allowing them to learn new skill sets. We want to communicate with every department, right? Communication is key across your organization. Again, developing metrics that optimize your people in your process, right? Metrics that are relevant for those folks that are transforming. You want to bring your legacy, i.e. mature applications, into the DevOps fold, right? Don't leave them behind. We want to make sure we're celebrating our wins. So don't let the opportunity go. When you achieve success in your production environments, make sure that you're celebrating those wins. And last but not least, we want to think about unifying tools and build a pipeline that supports all the dev teams. So the dev teams are building their code, but once they come together as part of the delivery pipeline to production, we want to think about tooling that helps enable them all to basically deliver in similar patterns. So that's the keys to success for unlocking your DevOps culture.
Lots of really good ones.
And so do we have, Charlene, do we have questions that have come in as I've been going through the slides?
We've got a ton of questions, but obviously we have lots of time for questions. So if you have a question and you've not used the control panel to type in your question and send it over, you have time to do it. Go ahead and do that now, and we'll jump right into the questions. First of all, you had mentioned this idea of the center of excellence to have a successful DevOps organization. Is that a necessity? I mean, does a company really have to do that?
That's a good question. I think the short answer is no. A center of excellence is definitely it sounds like almost like a little heavy and a little big. And for some companies, that might not be the right model. I think what organizations do need in some form is that consultative team, I'll say just for a second, but that place for application teams to go to start to answer questions. Because really, if you don't have that, if you don't, sometimes they used to call it an architecture board. Some companies still call it that. If you don't have that place to go bounce ideas off of, and to a team that basically understands the overall direction of the company, it gets really hard, because then teams start they don't just start, they continue to solve problems locally. So really what happens is all of a sudden now you have people and they kind of think, hey, we're going to do this DevOps thing and we're going to be more agile and deliver faster. But they actually start creating solutions that are only relative to maybe their particular application or their particular area. So having the ability to kind of take a step up from that and include, have a visibility across all of the application stacks, as an example, it doesn't have to be as formal as a center of excellence. It doesn't have to be like a different division within a company. It just really, you need that place to go as like a consultative, area where you can say, hey, this is what we're thinking of doing. This is what we're doing today. We're feeling pressure. We need to deliver faster. What would you recommend? And at that point, I think, now you're having a conversation, because they're going to look at what you're doing, what processes you're following, how you're delivering, etc. And they can start to guide in terms of saying, hey, did you realize that, maybe you didn't realize, but this team in this other location had a similar problem, and this is how they solved it. So I think, does that make sense in terms of, necessarily what that is?
Yeah, and I guess I would probably point out that Center of Excellence, as you said, doesn't have to be a whole separate organization within the company. I mean, it could be something as simple like a wiki, right? I mean, some reference area where somebody can go and just type in a question and get an answer, hopefully.
That's exactly right. One of our largest customers, they leverage the wiki as the primary site for that information. You're exactly right. And then they do have teams underneath that basically they manage that information. But you're exactly right. If I'm a new employee there, my very first day, I'm going to a wiki site to learn about, okay, here's the tools I'm going to use, here's the processes that I need to follow, etc. So yeah, lots of different options there.
Okay. Great. We've gotten a couple different questions in regarding the metrics. So can you kind of talk a little bit about what are some of the different or key DevOps metrics and maybe some of the ones that the successful DevOps organizations have used or are using?
Sure. So what I find in terms of metrics, I guess I'll break it down this way, is if we follow a traditional pipeline, let's say it's Dev, QA, Stage 4, I use that one a lot, right? Mm-hmm. Basically, the teams that work within those different areas really have to be able to answer three questions, right? What do I need, what do I need to get into that environment? What do I need while I'm in that environment? As well as what do I need to get out of it? So, that's what your project managers are, basically balancing and struggling with each day, right? How do I get my application changes moving forward? So therefore, I think it's important to be able to say you need metrics overall, like we talked about earlier, right? I need to be able to say how fast can a developer deliver a change to production. And then we want to be able to break that down and say, okay, let's use development for a second. A lot of times, developers talk in terms of metrics like code commits or, lines of code or, those types of metrics which are important to them. But one of the things we should be able to talk about as well is to say, okay, if we do deliver a piece of code that's faulty into our QA environment, how long does it take us to turn around that change, right? How long does it, take us to recognize, from the point of delivery, how long did it take us to be able to say, oh, there was a bug, a bug was found, mm-hmm. We could reproduce it, we could provide a fix, and then re-deliver that to our QA team. Because those are the things that are actually, really hurting your delivery pipeline. It's the 3 or 4 changes, for example, the development team is delivering to QA because they can't quite get it right. That's affecting not only your overall project timeline, but it's also affecting your ability to deliver better code faster. So when I recommend metrics, I tend to focus on those areas as well. Another good metric that I've seen, I just saw this recently, was a customer called in and they said one of the things they've been measuring is the wait times between certain tasks that weren't automated. So for them, they had a lot of activities as part of their delivery process where they had, like staging requirements, and they had to do different work that was outside of like the DevOps work, think of it like network services, DBAs, etc. Well, they started to measure wait time simply because they wanted to understand, do they need more resources, right? Do they need more people as part of the overall delivery process? So they didn't use it in a way that you think like, oh, we're going to blame, the DBAs are already holding us up. What they really actually started to discover was they were doing a lot of work with not enough people. So it actually, equated to bringing in some more staff to help accelerate the delivery. So in that case, as an example, the code was ready to ship. It just, they didn't have a way to get it onto the boat. So does that make sense in terms of thinking about the metrics even more locally, maybe even as an example to start with in the particular environments?
Yeah, I think so. I think that that's super helpful for more than a few of folks who have asked specifically about about metrics. And I actually have another one that's related that might be worth talking about as well. And that's the question of whether the data from metrics should be sourced automatically or manually. And what are going to be the pros and cons of doing it either way.
Well, I'm always a fan of automation there.
Yeah, right.
Well, it definitely, I think what happens with metrics, that's why I say that a lot, the word gets overused, is, reporting tends to be the last thing folks think about. We say, hey, we're going to build this really cool thing, and then it's almost like the afterthought of like, how are we going to measure it? How are we going to report on it, et cetera. So the very first part, I guess, of the answer, I think, is you have to have it as part of the conversation. Because if it's part of the conversation, then it's just as important as, hey, what branching strategy are we going to use? Or how are we going to make sure we communicate effectively to the users once the code is delivered? So it's one more thing that's on the table to talk about in terms of, can we automate this? Right? The last thing we want to do is create a modern delivery pipeline so developers can deliver code, in less than 2 weeks through production. But some, project manager somewhere has to go digging through emails to get the necessary reports for the project team. To me, that would be horrible. We're just pushing pain, onto other folks. So I think the real answer there is to, gets back to what do I need to get in and out of the environments. Metrics are should always be part of that conversation. And it's, metrics around like how long were we in that environment? How long, how many times did we have to restart? How long did it take to get a code change back into it, etc. So, okay. I think it's just part of it. It's like we've been talking about culture, right? Metrics should just be part of the culture.
Yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. Okay, great. We still have a lot of questions here, but there is time. If you have a question for TJ, go ahead and use your control panel, get it in. If we don't get to everybody's questions during the event, just know that TJ is going to be receiving a copy of all the questions, and I'm sure that he or somebody over at CBL Labs will be more than happy to follow up with you after the event. But let's try and get through as many as we can here. Our next question, we have a coaching teaching department that can't catch up with our delivery speed. So we stop before releasing finished software changes into production. What would be the best way to approach teaching people using the changed software? So I guess they're
yeah.
That's a problem if your teachers don't.
Yeah, it is. It actually, I gave that example. What actually, I always think of it as like, we all use the phrase drinking from a fire hose, right? It's like, imagine that organization that's feeling that pain, because the developers are all, everyone's like, oh, this is great. And they're celebrating, like, we're delivering faster. And there's parts of the organization like, we can't do this. We can't actually consume these changes. So my advice there, the thing that I would sit down and talk about is, I would ask is, are those teams included as part of the overall work that's being done to change the organization? If I had to guess from the outside, I would bet maybe they weren't brought in early on. It's almost like, it's kind of like we talked about the finance department taking, new changes to the particular ERP system. It's so critical to get insights and input from all the teams that are responsible for delivering the application. And I think training in those coaching teams that they described, the training departments, teams like QA, they almost tend to get like, set aside because there's such a focus on, the tooling, the application, the speed. You really, at the end of the day, have to find the right speed for your organization. I'll give an example. We have a large customer, software customer. They basically, provide online gaming. They basically were able to standardize their application release process, and I'll just talk about the production metrics, but they got it down to 9 hours. They were so happy it takes them to release software within a 9-hour window, which sounds kind of strange when we're talking about DevOps. We're like, shouldn't it be minutes? But that's with the speed of their organization, because when they got all of the different people to the table to say, hey, what do you need as part of the delivery process? That was the negotiated time for making sure that everyone could do their particular job. So I think it's kind of a cool story, because, if you were at a DevOps conference, people would be like, 9 hours, why aren't you trying to get it down to 4 minutes? The simple answer is 9 hours works for their organization, and it works for their release process. So I guess that's the two parts of my answer. One is make sure that your folks, everyone who's responsible for delivering the application, gets a voice at the table. And then two, finding, timings and metrics that fit your organization. It's not always about just getting it down to, 2 weeks or 5 minutes. Okay.
All right, great. Let's go ahead and move on to the next question. Let's see, in a DevOps role specifically, what % of companies do you consider are aware of that type of role and really want to have it within their organization?
I mean, I think that is one of the changes that's very apparent within this space. Is before DevOps used to be like the network, the sysadmins and those folks that were already doing, they were basically the Swiss Army knife of the company, right? They could do kind of everything. And then they moved into this new thing called DevOps. And when they got there, like, hey, wait a minute, this is the same job that I was doing before, except I have a cool title now. What I'm seeing more of, and it's actually, I think, I'll give you a perfect example. It's your operations folks in 5 years, we're not going to say operations anymore. They're actually retitling to site reliability engineer. Right, and I think that's actually a more appropriate title, right? Because these folks are basically responsible for making sure that the site is not only up and running, it's also responding to the needs of the customers. So it's not just some operations group anymore. I say just in air quotes, that's just basically keeping the lights on. So I think the same is happening for DevOps. It's saying, hey, if you want to truly, revolutionize what you're doing within your organization, you need people that understand the entire delivery pipeline. So that includes having like real DevOps style teams, meaning, like your developer and your QA and your operation people are working much closer together. And it means having specialists. I see that a lot, that these are true DevOps folks. They can build applications, they can, troubleshoot networks, they can manage cloud environments. They have like a lot of different skills that are part of this like modernization story.
Okay, great. Next question, and this one is actually related to organizations that have a lot of government oversight. So Joshua is asking, what cultural roadblocks are typical for those types of organizations? Those whose software development processes are subject to government oversight.
Yeah, those environments, the regulated environments, right? They are definitely a little bit tougher nut to crack. And I think what's interesting about that is the fact that those requirements aren't always necessarily imposed by the organization. So even if you think about like insurance companies that actually interact with government, entities, they're held to a different set of regulatory rules because they have to follow those rules to provide those services. So you can be talking about third-party vendors that you have to make sure you're compliant with, rules of the organization, etc. So my simple answer, which this isn't a simple question, but the first part I would say is it's still about getting the folks to the table initially as part of the, as to start the process out right. So that means saying, hey, how do we deliver applications today? And by the way, production might not be like your traditional data center where you're serving up applications, right? It might be a dark site that you can't even actually automate an application over to. But it's getting those teams together as part of that initial conversation and getting an understanding about what's needed to modernize your delivery. And again, it's easier said than done. I know that, and I know there's a whole bunch of things hanging on that statement. But I can tell you, I use this a lot, the analogy that says it's like a lot like math. Once you found out you've made a mistake, you can't solve it by going forward. You got to back up and figure out where you made the mistake. Well, what I'm trying to give the advice is start out from a place that says we're going to look at the entire pipeline and we're going to understand what are the needs of those different teams. How do I'll say it kind of again, is how do I get into that environment? What do I need while I'm there? And how do I get out of it? And so for government type of organizations, regulatory organizations, that becomes even more critical because those boundaries are just, you have stricter boundaries as in the application delivery pipeline. And you can't ignore them. It's not like you can say, hey, we're doing DevOps now. Well, I don't need to do those reports. I'm just going to give you code faster. They feel that pain even more that says, I can't move faster, or I can't just throw away these auditing requirements that are necessary. So that sounded like a really long-winded answer. Does it sound like we're kind of close to what was being asked by Joshua?
I hope so. Yeah, I think so. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to another question. Back to metrics again. When it comes to metrics, wouldn't it make more sense to be sure your metrics are actionable and metrics around business value and minimum viable product? Pam's got him covered.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly spot on. For whoever made that question, that statement is you're spot on. That's what I mean by when I say your metrics are relevant to your organization. If you're just measuring things to say, hey, XYZ, we increase speed by 40%, and there's no relevancy to that, I think it actually gets to be a little disenchanting, right? It turns into noise, into the ethosphere. It's like, yeah, we're speeding up, but what are we accomplishing? In my mind, and what I've seen at most organizations that are really successful is exactly the fact that they are actionable metrics. It's something that you're basically, maybe you haven't looked at that particular part of your delivery process, or maybe you are already looking at it and you're trying to figure out ways in which to, optimize on that. But it has to be part of the conversation as well. Like, I'll give a perfect example. In Jenkins, there's, who broke the build plugin, right? And I've seen it happen more often than not where developers are like, hey, we put that plugin in and we have that board all over our development teams. And all of a sudden it turns into a source of embarrassment because you're like, oh my goodness, I'm the name on who broke the build because I have a bad commit. So you talk about like culture, where culture is most important. Metrics can have the same effect. They can be very negative if they're given in the light of saying, hey, this team is, taking up X% of the delivery process and their numbers aren't going up. Well, if there's no context to that, then you're going to create problems. I'll give a perfect example. I see this all the time. If you ask application teams who's slowing down your process, your delivery pipeline, they'll say QA. They're like, oh, QA is always slowing me down. We want to deliver faster, blah, blah, blah. But what's really funny is if we all get to the table, we all talk together. If you ask QA says, well, I have a 2-week timeline to finish my testing, and the developers had to deliver 5 times to get the code to a point where I could test it. So having that kind of metric of saying, okay, yeah, what's time to delivery? What does my project plan and my metrics look like while I'm there? But also, how many times did I have to restart my testing because of an external event? To me, that's an actionable metric. It's like, hey guys, I understand we have, a process we have to follow, but we also had to restart X number of times every time we go into this process. So
Thanks.
that's where I think that's good conversation at that point, right? Now your dev and QA teams are talking. They're like, okay, how do we work together to make this better? So, metrics, they really are key to the success of all this.
All right, great. We are about 6 minutes to the top of the hour. I think we have time for one or two more questions. So let's go ahead and move along. Okay, so this question has to do with an organization that's kind of moving to DevOps. And they're using ITIL processes now. So how can we differ ITIL and DevOps framework? How do we prioritize the issues in between DevOps cases? So kind of the spaces in between, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I always think of it, DevOps is such a cultural, it's such a cultural change to an organization, right? So it doesn't replace what you're doing with ITIL. So I think of it sometimes this way is, when Agile, when everyone say, hey, we're going to go Agile, I think a lot of people hopped on that train and said, oh, Agile means I don't have to do, I don't have to create functional specs anymore. I can just build things and deliver them faster. And the rest of the organization kind of looked and said, wait a minute, what are you doing here? Like, you can't change the framework just because, you're doing this new thing. I think the question that is being asked is important, is that you're not going to change your framework, and and most companies probably can't change that part of their framework. So really, if you're going to do this thing called DevOps, if you're really going to try to bring dev and operations closer together and make it more functional so that you can deliver, more sound code, you can do it in a more repeatable, consistent manner, you're actually supposed to be supporting and enabling that framework. So you had asked the question earlier, Charlene, is it better to get automated metrics or is it better to do them manually? This to me feeds into the answer as well, which is, if you have a particular set of requirements, no matter what the framework is that you're using, you should be talking about that as part of your process change. You should say, okay, we're going to move to this new model. The developers are going to be able to, do X, Y, and Z changes in order to enable, faster delivery, let's say, for example. But what does that mean to everybody else? And not just the people, but it's also the process, right? People, process, tools. So if I already have this framework process that requires, specific information at certain points of time, again, it should just be built into the overall solution. So most of the time I find with these types of frameworks, what they're really looking for is more formal type of structure around things like documentation, more formal things about deadlines and timelines. And so, again, I'll go back to the easy part, the first part of the answer, which is involve everybody in the process so that everybody understands what's required. And then also then all of a sudden you can start to build in solutions that are, relevant to the organization.
All right, great. Let's see, moving rapidly along here. From your experience, how has IT organizational structure either helped or hindered the DevOps culture?
I wonder where this question's coming from. Usually it's the IT organization that's pushing that change. Can I ask a follow-up question? Well, my first thought is, and hopefully this is where we're going with that, is sometimes you'll have part of the IT organization that's really excited about the change and the changes that are coming, and you'll have other parts of them that are not as excited. So we're not even talking about the other folks that are involved with application delivery, like the examples we used earlier with trainers and marketing. We're just talking about the IT umbrella, which is usually composed of all, your technical folks that are delivering that. And so I think, I guess where I'm going with my answer is, when I think of the slides we talked about today, the topics around leadership, I think it's really important for even your IT leadership to be on the same page. I'll give an example of that. Back in my enterprise IT days, I worked in an organization where there was a CIO and 3 directors. And it was kind of apparent, at times that the 3 directors weren't really on the same page in terms of the changes that we were making to the organization. But that's important because, they're leading the IT organization. So I think it's important if you're going to have IT initiatives like DevOps, usually that's where the change is being not only built, but it's also being delivered from. it's important that folks understand, like, what are we trying to accomplish? Why is this important to the organization? Why is this change necessary in the first place?
That makes a lot of sense. Okay. Well, unfortunately, that is all the time that we have for the questions. So I would like to thank everybody who did submit your questions. As I said before, if we didn't get to your question during the event, TJ or somebody at ZBA Labs, I'm sure we'll be more than happy to follow up with you post-event. And I also want to let folks know that we had 5 winners five people who found the Easter egg in the webinar.
All right.
So congratulations to you all. You'll be contacted after the event for that. And for those who didn't know, TJ presented 7 keys and not 6 keys, as he said originally at the beginning of the presentation. So again, if you missed any or all of the events, we did record it. So you'll be receiving a link to access the webinar on demand. And the webinar is also going to be located on devops.com on demand. So you can always check the site there to access it there. And we've got a slew of other webinars on the site. So be sure to check those out as well. TJ, thank you so much for giving us such a great presentation. I got a ton out of it. I'm sure the audience did as well. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and thank you to everybody who attended today's webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon. I was the moderator for today's event, and I bid you good day. Thank you.